Thank you, Michelle. That just about used up my 10 minutes, so I might sit down again. Thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly today. Originally, I was going to speak straight after Julia Grant, and she was going to talk to you about the State Adaptation Framework and where we're at with that. I'll perhaps just touch on that briefly, but I wanted to spend only about 5 minutes talking about water and in the Eyre Peninsula regional context, and then I want to spend about 5 minutes on adaptation pathways and the development of our adaptation plan on Eyre Peninsula. The slide behind me, right up in the top corner of that slide, is where SA Water have their major resource on Eyre Peninsula, and I don't mean the blue stuff, theirs is on the land side, but wind farms at Cathedral Rocks and the obvious potential to desal with renewables up against an existing SA Water infrastructure. I just want to make some brief points, and clearly 10 minutes doesn't give me an option to go into detail, and as usual I'll probably try and say too much. My involvement in water clearly was in my NRM days, or catchment days, and the work on EP was pretty much completed in 2008, 2009. SA Water's long-term master plan for potable water on EP was a crucial document, and that's been completed for some time. One of the things Carleen Maywell did way back then was help us establish a community consultation process. So we set up an annual demand and supply statement for the region and reporting to a strategic regional coalition of local government, regional development and natural resource management. That mechanism is in place, has been used since then, and is part of the adaptive management, I believe, or adaptive governance of water on Eyre Peninsula. On top of that, we then saw the introduction of the Water for Good process in South Australia, the 5-yearly review of regional water resources, and fortunately our region some time ago was the first regional Water for Good plan that was adopted. So for me, in relation to potable water, we have adaptive governance measures in place, the machinery's there, it's working, it gives us trigger points and a 5-year warning period where demand and supply may get out of balance, therefore time to put infrastructure solutions into place. As I said, that's adaptive governance in my mind. It's part of our new regional adaptation plan. It's part of the region's governance. I don't think the issues around water on EP are any more difficult now because we have that machinery for decision making in place than they're ever likely to be. We just need at the appropriate time to come up with infrastructure decisions. So that is part of an adaptation plan. We've moved a long way since 2008, 2009, but we had this pioneering mechanism developed way back then. The other interesting thing about that is, in fact, the coalition between local government, regional development and natural resource management. We have 11 councils on EP and it's like herding cats, with all due respect. It's important that those three regional stakeholders come together in the water space, but in the regional infrastructure space, in the planning space and in the climate change space. I chair EPICA, which is the Integrated Climate Change Agreement on EP, which brings those groups together. But we heard this morning about regionalisation. It seems to me that the climate change issue needs to be taken up in the conversations around regionalisation, regional decision making, regional authorities, where this cohort of regional stakeholders actually grabs these issues and deals with them at the high level, regional level, setting out a regional vision and absolutely influencing regional development plans, so that we actually move some of these high level strategic decisions in planning and in the whole of region infrastructure away from individual councils to a regional presence, whether that be a group of elected people or a mix of elected and skills-based. I think that's a conversation we have to have, and in my mind, that's ultimately where climate change should sit. But in the interim, we have the State climate adaptation framework. We have 4 plans released, I think maybe 5 now. Northern and York, the Southern Councils in the metropolitan area, Murray-Darling and the EP plan, and I think perhaps the Barossa plan may be on the table now. So we've still got a few to go, but that framework is delivering adaptation plans. They are not documents that give us the absolute answer to go forward. They are just the first iteration of an evolutionary process that we are absolutely going to have to undertake in the generations going forward, because the drivers that are affecting climate change will continue to change. So we're just at the start of a process. A couple of other water issues. So for me, on Eyre Peninsula, the potable stuff is under good governance now. There are other issues around water that are not just delivered through the pipeline, as you all know, or through reuse schemes. Climate change is changing rainfall, but we're not too sure how, although the new projections give us some indication. But it's not just about annual rainfall, it's about timing of rainfall and distribution. It's about the interaction between rainfall and temperature and evaporation, which ultimately equates to soil moisture conditions. Soil moisture conditions affect farming. They affect the economic drivers in the region. We need to understand that better. We need to understand that interaction with our crop types. Soil moisture condition greatly affects ecosystems and our landscape, and where ecosystem services are within those landscapes and where they're likely to go. An enormous area that needs conversation and discussion at the regional level. Urban design we've heard a lot about this morning. A good project going on in Melbourne, the 40% canopy, 4 degrees project, is something that we need to have a really good look at here in Adelaide. The Premier's already talked about parklands and greening, etc. With the urban heat island effect, it's going to become a serious issue in terms of the well-being of our community that lives and works within the city. 10% canopy cover, and I don't necessarily mean the cover of a lemon-scented gum, but something that's got a good canopy, can reduce the ambient temperature by 1 degree. It's no good making decisions about these things in 20 years' time. In 20 to 25 years' time, we're likely to see 2 degrees warming. These canopies are going to take a while to put in place and a while to work out how we're going to actually maintain the canopies. Do we use deciduous trees that may accumulate soil moisture in the winter time and supplement it with reused stormwater harvested water in the summertime? I don't know, but they're all issues that need to be on the table now. So the make-ups of our communities here in Adelaide, but also in our regional areas, it will be affected by water and soil moisture conditions over time, and we're already starting to see that unfold. So I've just very briefly touched on a whole raft of issues that needs conversation, debate and research, and clearly a lot of research has already happened. But I have in my head something else that I think is important, and the accumulation of knowledge is really no good to us unless we can actually reflect that in the management of stakeholders and industry decision makers, at communities and ultimately individuals at the end of the day. So one of the challenges at the moment is actually the transfer of that accumulating high level, high quality scientific knowledge to land managers like me, to ordinary people on the ground, and therein lies a challenge. I want to just briefly now, I've got 4 or 5 slides, to touch on the Eyre Peninsula Adaptation Plan if I can. Perhaps we'll slip to that. The first slide I've got up is Mark Howden's Progressive Adaptation Plan slide, and it talks about primary, secondary adaptation moving into transformation. When we're dealing with adaptation planning and developing regional adaptation plans, we need more than anything to understand that slide. Clearly, with the warming we've had now, we're already seeing primary and some secondary adaptation, and in some cases perhaps bordering on transformational change. But when we get anywhere near 2 degrees, that transformational space is going to be a space we're in. So in developing the plan, that's one of the things we had in mind. 2 degrees warming, driving climate change, absolutely radically mean that we have to understand that adaptation pathway. The second thing we used in our planning process was this decision timeline. It's really a timeline that was developed for the decision making around the Thames Barrier and what to do with that in a changing set of circumstances with sea level rise. But when we're talking about climate change and adaptation, we tend to get bogged down in an enormous amount of issues and detail. If we use a decision timeline mechanism, it allows us to put aside those things which are short term, which we may make decisions about annually or biannually or every 5 years, and that are not really affected by climate change in a day-to-day sense. So why talk about them in the climate change space? Let's get them off the table and deal with those issues where we can make a difference, where we can prioritise resources and build the capacity of our decision makers that are making those decisions today which have long lifetimes. And water infrastructure is one of those spaces. Where we put new suburbs, the peri-urban, urban development issues, things like that we're making decisions today about. We absolutely need to have the climate change context in that decision-making process. So that was the other principal issue we used. We came up with a series of adaptation plans, applied adaptation pathways, and this is just one example on water. We had 4 or 5 from the fishing industry, some in local government, some in farming, some in infrastructure, and this is the water one. It's not particularly clear, but it starts to show us that we can start to think about where we make decisions rather than trying to sit down and solve our problems straight away. Our adaptation plan is not about providing a solution to an individual problem. It's actually about a methodology of how we need to make decisions going forward, keeping our options open, allowing us to make decisions and perhaps change decisions as circumstances change. It gives us a series of adaptation options with a bit of a vision about where we might come out. And surprisingly, during the development of this plan, this methodology was understood. It was facilitated by Mark Siebentrick and Mark Stafford Smith, and the participants actually could get this and were identifying with the decision-making process. I don't want to talk about the detail because we haven't got time, but that's the water example, and it shows us where we might need to make decisions. Unfortunately, a lot of decisions there in the 5-year sort of period in terms of infrastructure, augmentation of supply, the question about an engineering connection between the SA system and the EP system, desalination. Those decisions will be made over time. Just to finish, I just wanted to throw up the last one other pathway just to illustrate the complexity of it and where trigger points may be further down the track. This was an unexpected outcome of the planning process we undertook. We ended up with regional scale cross-sectoral adaptation priorities that fell out of the process after we put it all together. And that just gives you some idea of some of the strategic decisions that need to be made in the region, and I would suggest at the high-level regional level, about issues that we need to address going forward. And it shows us roughly a time frame. This is crude, it's early, it's the first step in this process. It's the first time applied adaptation pathways thinking has been used at the regional level. We adopted some thinking from the Thames Barrier, as I said, and some science from Hasnoot in the Netherlands, and this was the first regional attempt globally to put this together. But it's given us a simplified way of looking at developing adaptation plans, transferring knowledge, building capacity at the level that the stakeholders at the regional level can understand. And ultimately, I think if we can go through an implementation phase, and it would be interesting to do this in conjunction with the Goyder Institute and its release of data, ultimately individuals in the community in day-to-day decision-making will have the capacity to make decisions in the context of understanding climate change. Thank you for the opportunity.